It's saying, I care about what's right, but I will not sin to get what I want. I will not worship control because Christ gets my heart. I'm at His table. A table can feed you and it will form you. Have you ever left a dinner thinking, what just happened? That wasn't just food. It was that. But then something shifted. You're laughing, you're passing the potatoes, and then someone brings up that topic. Right? Religion, politics, that family situation. And all of a sudden you can feel it that this isn't just a meal anymore, it becomes a loyalty test. Because tables are never just about food, tables are about belonging. A table says, these are my people. A table says, this is what we celebrate. A table says, here's what you're allowed to question, and here's what you're not to question. You may say, Seth, what does this have to do with the Christian faith? Well, everything. Because Paul is dealing with what he's dealing with the Corinthians here is basically this. Can I sit at any table I want to and still claim Jesus? Is worship just a private matter, and so therefore it's harmless if I actually fellowship and participate at all different types of tables, all types of gods? And what's interesting here is Paul basically invites the Corinthians when he says, listen, I want you to put on your thinking caps. Notice what he says there in verse 15. I speak as to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. He's like, look, I'm going to appeal to your own senses. You understand this already. You're just not connecting the dots. If you've not been with us so far, we've been in a series here on 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 and 10. We wrap up 2 weeks from today. And so far, Paul's been teaching the Corinthians about what Christian freedom is. That it is real, but it's never to be reckless, right? And what should limit our liberty, our freedom, is love, a love for God, but he begins more with love for other people. How would the exercise of our freedom affect others? And then Paul in chapter 9 explained that he limits his own freedom to be compensated, to be paid for his ministry. He set that aside because he wanted there not to be an obstacle to the people listening to his preaching. And then we saw last week that he warns them not to play with temptation, not to think they're above that. And then in this passage, he sort of has one main command that he's worried about them understanding. He's warned them not to be disqualified. He's warned them not to not learn from the example of Israel. And then he gives this command in verse 14. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Flee from idolatry. And that's the truth that Paul wants to change us. That we're to flee from idolatry by giving Christ our undivided loyalty. And Paul gives us 3 boundaries to sort of help us to make sure that we remain loyal to Christ. That first boundary is that what Paul discusses in verses 15 through 18. That is that worship is never neutral. Worship is never neutral because it draws you into fellowship with what you honor. It's not neutral because whatever you're worshiping is bringing you into fellowship, into participation with whatever you're honoring or worshiping. And Paul goes straight to the Lord's Supper as an illustration of this. Notice there in verse 16, the cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Now the key word there is participation, fellowship. Now here Paul is not giving some technical lecture on communion, how it works. Rather, he's making a plain point that when Christians gather in worship and they eat and drink at the Lord's table, it is real fellowship and participation with Christ by faith. There's not only this fellowship with Christ, there's also participation and fellowship with one another. Notice in verse 17. Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. So Paul's driving home this point that, listen, you guys know that tables just aren't for food. When you eat the Lord's table, it's not just food. There's something spiritual happening. There's a participation. There's a binding of you to Christ and a binding of you to one another as you eat at that table as part of worship. It's not a neutral thing. It's drawing you into fellowship with what you're worshiping, what you're honoring. Paul then moves from this new covenant meal of the Lord's table, and he begins to talk about Old Testament worship. There in verse 18, he says, "Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar?" So in the Old Testament, they would have sacrifices that were made, certain offerings. The person bringing the offering would eat some of that meal, and the priest who made the sacrifice would eat with them, right? And so Paul's point is, when this was happening in the Old Testament in Israel, they were participating in that worship service. It wasn't a neutral act of worship. Okay? You eat the sacrifice. This is not a neutral snack. It's a covenant act. You're saying this altar belongs to the Lord. He is my God. I am His servant. So in that meal was identification. It was fellowship. It was communicating allegiance. So Paul's saying, you guys already know this. You're sensible people. Repeated participation in honoring someone shapes your allegiance to them. When you consistently join yourself to that, what you consistently treat as worthy of your trust and your hope, you're quietly training your heart, your soul, to belong to that thing or to that person. So, if that's true, right, this first boundary is true, if participation in something creates fellowship with what you're trusting or honoring, then the real question they should be asking is not, is it just meat, right? Because that's the issue at heart here, is that some of the Christians were going to these pagan temples. For example, there would have been a temple to Dionysus in this area, and they would go and they would eat a meal as part of the worship service. And Paul's saying there's nothing wrong with the meat itself. You're free to eat the meat, but if you're eating as part of a worship service, that's a problem. And he's explaining why that is. He says, instead of asking, is there something wrong with this meat I'm eating? He said, the better question to ask is, who am I fellowshipping with when I sit at this table in this pagan temple and eat this meat as part of a worship service to a pagan god? What am I fellowshipping with? And that leads us to our second boundary. We want to keep boundaries that keep us loyal to Christ. Paul's saying you've got to understand that worship is never neutral, because it's drawing you into fellowship with what you honor. And the second thing that he mentions, after he points out communion and he shows these sacred meals of the Old Testament, he reminds us that idolatry, the worship of a false god, is never harmless, because it draws you into fellowship with demons. It's not a harmless thing. Paul is anticipating the Corinthians to push back on the argument he's making. So in verse 19 he says, "What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything?" He's already dealt with this back in chapter 8. But basically, they're saying, Paul, are you saying that a statue is a real god? Are you saying that because that meat was a part of a worship service, now it's magically been contaminated because it was offered to some pagan god? And Paul agrees with them to a certain point. We've already seen this in chapter 8. He's saying idols aren't real gods. There isn't a real Zeus or real gods behind these people. We know that. There's only one true God. But then he adds a warning to this. He agrees to a certain point, but then he warns them there in verse 20, showing through his warning that this isn't a neutral thing. It's not harmless. Verse 20. What pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. So Paul says, I do not want you to be participants with demons. Now again, notice that word participants. Participation, participants. Fellowship, sharing, communion. Paul's saying even if an idol is nothing, and it isn't, the worship behind it is not nothing. There is a spiritual reality underneath the false worship that these people are participating in, and when you participated in it, you are fellowshipping with those things as well. Now, Paul isn't saying here that we can't share a meal with a non-Christian neighbor or a co-worker or a family member. Right? He's not saying that every restaurant, if it's not run by a Christian or something like that, that it's somehow a table of demons. Okay? What Paul's concern here is worship participation. Because in this context, there were meals a part of a worship service. And many of the Christians in this church were going to do that. And Paul's saying, when you do it, even though that idol isn't real, there are demons behind it. And your participation is causing you to fellowship with those demons. It's not a casual thing that they're doing here. Because tables form fellowship. And fellowship shapes the loyalty of that person. Now, if you're here this morning and you're maybe exploring Christianity, you might bristle at the word demons. But if you stay with Paul's logic, I think you'll find yourself, if you have some issues with the idea of demons existing, you'll see that Paul's logic actually comes through. Because worship is spiritually real. What you treat, when you treat a sort of a rival table as ultimate, right? So this is really what a false god is. It's trusting in any, whether it's a false god you've made up, like happened in pagan religion, or if it's other things in life that aren't necessarily bad in themselves, but you begin to treat them as your ultimate hope. This is the reason you're alive. You're relying upon this to give you meaning and purpose. If you're treating anything else as ultimate other than the God who's created you, that's idolatry. You're identifying with something else that will bring you security or hope or peace. Paul's point is that's not a harmless thing that we do. Because we're entering into fellowship with something that is opposed to God Himself. The same demons behind this pagan worship are the same demons driving people to live for money or to live for fame or to live for comfort. Same activity. We're going to get to this at the end here in a minute. I'm just trying to help you see Paul's logic here. So Paul here isn't trying to make us obsessed with demons or some dark powers. What he's trying to do is to help us to be honest. That idols don't just sit on a shelf and we get to manipulate them. Idols, that is, worshiping anything other than the true God, actually shapes you, not you controlling it. Now, and when you see Paul's logic here, that participation in something is not neutral, it's not harmless, it's actually real fellowship, and that fellowship behind it is demonic activity, it makes total sense the heart stance that Paul takes there in verse 21, where he's saying, listen, you can't have fellowship with Christ and have fellowship with that which opposes Him. And that really is the third boundary that Paul lays out here. That divided loyalty to Christ is never sustainable because Christ will not share His people. Here's his conclusion there in verse 21. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Now notice here, he doesn't say you probably shouldn't, right? It's frowned upon, even if you do it, but it's frowned upon. No, that's what he's saying. He's saying you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. And why is this? Because tables express belonging. If you're at Christ's table, you belong to Christ. If you're sitting at the table of rival gods to Christ, you belong to them. That's the logic he's using. And Christ doesn't tolerate loyalty as one among many. And sometimes that can be a little bit offensive to our ears. But in one sense, it's really not something that's odd to us. For example, if you could imagine yourself at a wedding reception, and someone stands up and they're going to give a wedding toast and they raise a glass there in that moment, we know that they're raising that glass not just as an act of drinking, right? There's a meaning behind what's taking place in that moment. They're declaring an honor and a celebration of this couple and them coming together in marriage. Now, with that as the backdrop, now imagine someone stands up and raises a glass to the bride and groom, and at the same time, one of the bride's ex is at the wedding. Right? And they honor a glass to honor the bride and groom, and then they raise a glass to honor the ex who's still trying to get with the bride. You say, Seth, well, we've got to be inclusive, right? Got to make sure no one feels left out. No. We automatically know that the person that does that is crossing a social barrier. Betrayal. Because you can't honor the bride and groom and then honor someone who's established as a rival in that relationship. So when Paul says you cannot drink both cups, that's why he means it. And then he asks there in verse 22, shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Right? That's what would happen in that wedding scenario, right? Are we stronger than he? And when we hear the word jealousy there, we can wrongly think just insecurity. Sometimes that's what's driving in jealousy. But that's not God's jealousy. God's jealousy isn't because he's needy, right? That's not his issue. This is the jealousy of covenant love. He's jealous because he has a love that refuses to share those he loves with things that will destroy them. That's why he can't tolerate it. God isn't jealous because he's fragile. He's jealous because he's faithful. He cares. He's committed to his people, and he doesn't want to see harm come to them. So that's why Paul's logic is here. The Lord's table is real participation and fellowship with Christ. The Corinthians would have said, amen. Rival tables involve real fellowship with those people and those things that oppose God. Therefore, divided loyalty sitting at both tables is not sustainable. Christ will not share his people. And that's why Paul's command there in verse 14 is so urgent. Flee idolatry. Flee idolatry. Before we ask, where does idolatry show up in us? Well, Paul has already given us a warning sign back earlier in this chapter. Back in verse 7, he says, do not be idolaters as some of them, that is the Israelites, were. And then he listed out these various ways that they express their idolatry. We saw that last week. And one of the ones that he landed on, and we touched on a bit last week, is verse 10, where he said, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. This jealous God would not tolerate a divided loyalty which expressed itself in grumbling against God. So, how do we think about this today? Because again, I don't know about you, but I've not seen a local temple to Dionysus, right? So what does this mean for us today, where we do not live in a society where pagan worship, thankfully, is not prominent? If we're not tempted to walk into a pagan temple and eat meat as part of a worship service, but that doesn't mean that we're free from idolatry. In our world today, idolatry is often quieter and respectable and hidden under normal life. And one of the ways that respectable idolatry shows itself, that divided loyalty, is with grumbling. Grumbling is the soundtrack. It's the worship songs when you're worshiping other false gods. That's how you can know. And so grumbling, while it's not the main point of 1 Corinthians 10, 14 to 22, it is a common fruit that will show up in your life when you're sitting at a different table, not Christ's table. Because underneath grumbling is an idol. There can be actually many idols underneath that. Control is one we're going to focus on, but it could be approval, it could be security, validation, all kinds of things that we could be looking for. But control is a great one for us to sort of focus on as the heart of what's going on. So, you and I may not use the term idolatry, but what it means is to be ruled by something that you can't quite put down. I have to have this in order for life to work the way I think it should. Now, ultimately, that always should be God. But we struggle remaining at God's table. There's other things that are promised to us at other tables that seem to be more on our appetite, and so they lure us away, right? And so we want to be aware of this. You may need something like approval, comfort, or control so badly that you need it that when it's threatened in your life, you become somebody that you don't like. When that's happening in your life, the Bible says that's idolatry. You may not have that term, but you can relate to that experience. All human beings do and experience this. This is what, when we worship something other than God, this is the result. It's promising us life, but the reality is it ends up taking life from us. It's deceitful. So, now we need to be careful before we look at grumbling, because when some people hear don't grumble, they think Christianity means being passive or numb or indifferent. And that's not a biblical understanding of what grumbling is addressed here, right? It's not wrong to notice that something's broken. It's not wrong to honestly be bothered by incompetence, by injustice, or by danger to your life, right? And it's not wrong to correct or to confront or to pursue what's right. That's not necessarily grumbling or complaining, okay? The question becomes, in what spirit am I bringing that concern, right? And where does it go? Godly concern typically moves toward prayer and humility, towards clarity, towards directness, that is, addressing that concern to the person who can address it. It's constructive action. The goal of voicing that concern is to repair and to make things better. Whereas grumbling usually moves toward heat without light, right? It's just mere emotion, but not any clarity to solve the problem. It's just contempt on people. These people, unbelievable that they would do that, right? That's contempt. That's not godly concern. Vetting to bystanders versus recruiting agreement versus addressing the problem. Punishing people with sarcasm and coldness or self-justification, right? Because I'm right, I get to be harsh, right? That's how you can know the difference between legitimately correcting and voicing concern about things as we ought to as Christians, and grumbling, which flows from worshiping something other than God. So, grumbling isn't simply having a complaint. It's when the complaint becomes a posture of life. When the heart stops seeking truth and repair and starts seeking relief through bitterness and control. So, and here's how this connects to this passage. Whatever table you're sitting at, if you're sitting at Christ's table, it will come forth not as grumbling. If you're sitting at, for example today, the table of control, the idol of control, then it will become grumbling. And it will show up in the tone in which you speak. Because idols leak out of our mouths. Right? So let's use an illustration here. Imagine you're driving. You're running behind, and someone does something careless. Right? Cuts you off, tailgates you, swerves, haven't yet mastered the blinking signal, right? Now, is it wrong to want people to drive safely and competently? No, right? That is a legitimate concern that we can have, and we should recruit more people to that, right? Safety matters. Consideration of other drivers on the road, loving your neighbor, matters. We're not the only one on the road. But right there in the moment of decision, will that concern stay a concern, or will it become grumbling at the person? right? And this is often how it shifts, right? The surface complaint is that was unsafe, or that was inconsiderate, or that was dumb. And I think all three of those are legitimate reactions to other drivers. Right? But the deeper demand can be, I need control. I need my plan to go my way, and you're getting in the way of that. And so if this day isn't obeying me and functioning the way I need in this journey on the road, then we're going to have problems. When things work well on the road, the idol of control is great. But when other people get in the way, that's when control is our functioning God. And the fruit shows up fast. We get anxious. I'm going to miss that meeting because this person's doing this. This is going to happen, and then this is going to happen because I missed the meeting, and all these other problems are going to occur. Anxiety comes in. Or we get angry. Because everything detailed out, and this person had to do that. It's messed me up. We get bitter towards people because they're not acting the way that we want them to. We get restless because even 5 hours later, we're still stewing and venting about people, what someone did on the highway. When that happens, that's not just a bad moment. That's not just a concern. That's worship revealing itself. We've been sitting not at Christ's table, but our allegiance has been given to the idol of control. So, when that happens, how do we apply this idea we looked at last week with verse 13, that with every temptation, God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. So when that person cuts you off, guess what? God knows you can handle that with His faithfulness. He's going to provide you of a way of escape. So what does it look like to do that? Again, it's not by pretending that safety doesn't matter, but what it does mean is refusing to worship control. So we name what's happening underneath. Lord, my heart is demanding control right now. You've got to preach to yourself, right? I'm acting like my schedule is the only thing that matters in all of the world, and everything should fit what I think. I'm not that important. I'm just not. And then turn it into a quick prayer of surrender. Lord, You are my sovereign. Help me to release my grip on control and to trust You. Keep me from sinning in my anger. Help me to love my neighbor who is acting stupid right now, right? That's a fairly appropriate evaluation. Name it. Ask for God's help in prayer, and then take one concrete step of obedience, right? Maybe relaxing your body. It may be refusing retaliation to the person. You could give thanks for the situation. Man, that was careless, but Lord, thank You for preserving us from being in an accident. Thank You for caring about that. Right? Refuse to go into the office or come into the home and use it as a vent session of how bad driving is out on the roads. And if this person is really a threat, maybe they're seemingly drinking and driving under the influence, you may have to call and report their vehicle to the authorities so that they can deal with that situation. Right? All of those things could be appropriate ways to respond to it. That's how we work through those steps. It's saying, I care about what's right, but I will not sin to get what I want. I will not worship control because Christ gets my heart. I'm at His table, not at these other rival gods. Now, we've got to be careful because we don't just hear this, flee idolatry, and think, well, that's our takeaway. We just got to try harder to be aware of these things and stop being, irritated and grumbling about these things. Well, that's part of it. Paul does say that, flee idolatry. That's a very clear command that he calls us to do. But we also have to understand how that's going to happen. We put off one God, but we have to replace Him with the true God. We have to flee idolatry by giving our undivided loyalty to Christ. As Christians, we feel the heat, we feel the temptation in this way and in many other ways. And the point is not to act like we don't feel it. The point is that we don't save ourselves just by our own willpower. We come back to Christ. We come back to the one who has given himself for us, and we learn a new kind of loyalty, a new kind of participation with him that changes who we are. Which is why Paul isn't just saying, be careful, flee idolatry. He's saying, flee that and step back to Christ's table. The participation that you have in the cup of blessing and the body of Christ that was broken for you. Let's return to that dinner we were at earlier. Once those topics come up, you feel the dividing lines happening at that table. Pressure with it, you realize that this isn't just about food, it's about allegiance. The table we're at is shaping what we praise, what we fear, what we're allowed to say, and who we're allowed to be. We've all felt this. And Paul says that that's not just a social thing. He's like, there's something spiritual going on. Because worship, what we're giving our allegiance to, is never a neutral thing. Tables form fellowship, and divided fellowship between Christ and any other god, that is not something that's sustainable for the Christian life. That's why Paul's call here is so crystal clear. Flee idolatry. Focus on the participation that you have with Christ. And Christianity isn't just stop sitting at the wrong tables. It is that, but it's an invitation to a better one. Because the Lord's table isn't a symbol that leaves you by yourself. Paul says the cup and the bread are participation, real fellowship with Christ by faith, which means every time that we come to communion, like we did last week, Jesus is doing something, not just with you, but He's doing something to you. You're being bound to Him. He's telling us, listen, you don't have to secure control yourself. You don't have to be ruled by anxiety. You don't have to vent your way to peace. You don't have to punish people by grumbling about what's wrong with them or the things around us. At Christ's table, Christ doesn't take your life from you. He gives you His life. He doesn't demand your blood. He gives His. And He doesn't crush you for failing. He doesn't just try to tell you to edit the tone of your words. He asks you a deeper question. Will you come? Will you trust me? So this week, when your plan gets crossed, and it's going to happen, and you feel that familiar heat rising in your soul, when grumbling starts feeling like a home, don't just try to edit your tone of your words. Ask the deeper question. Whose table am I sitting at right now? And if it's not Christ, then you need to flee. You need to ask Christ to say, you're my Lord, not my schedule, not my comfort, not my control, not my plans. Flee because He is better. And come because at His table is life. Let's pray.